I just feel good that we got in the chairs.
We're good. We're live.
Oh.
I'm Ginger Casper. Welcome to Continuing Human Education at Workflow. Thank you to Sarah for being here with us today, and to Cynthia. This is our Continuing Human Education, which is just an invitation to a conversation. We're not a TED Talk. We don't want to blow anybody's mind. We just want to invite you to participate and learn. It's our sincere hope that we build and empower our community through these conversations. Thank you for being with us today. If you're participating online and you know someone else who's interested, please share so that they can participate as well. This is our moderator for this entire series, Cynthia Garcia, and she is an immigrant rights activist. I'm going to hand it over to you. Get out of here.
No, thank you, and thank you for everyone that joined us for our very first one, where we had Cherie Dickerson from Black Lives Matter OKC. I am really excited for today's conversation with Sarah, who I have the privilege truly to learn a lot from, and who I think specifically during the pandemic, there has just been an opportunity to just continue to build relationship, build community, and truly that is the goal of these conversations, right? Like, let's invite each other into what our shared values are. So, as Ginger shared, my name is Cynthia Garcia. For those who don't know me, I'm an immigrant rights organizer, so a lot of the work that I do is around my own directly impacted status as an undocumented queer person in the state. So really excited to be hosting and talking about civics and what that means and how does community get engaged in that. So before I keep going on a whole journey and story about why I love Sarah, I'm gonna give you the mic, Sarah, and let us know a little bit about yourself for many folks that don't know you yet.
Yeah, halito, saha chifo at Sarah Adams-Cornell, Choctaw Hoyo Sia, so Ishki, Tammy Adams, Sapogni, and Dorothy Jefferson, Oklahoma City, Atali. I'm Sarah Adams-Cornell. I'm a proud Choctaw woman. I am the daughter of Tammy Adams and the granddaughter of Dorothy Jefferson. I live here in Oklahoma City, or what now is known as Oklahoma City, and I'm just real glad to be here. I was picking chips off myself because this is how we do. Like, we go ahead of time and we go get some food, and I'm still cleaning up, but that's how relaxed it is up in here. But I wanted to also acknowledge that we are on Wichita homelands, and then later the Comanche, the Kickapoo, the Kiowa, the Osage, and then everybody else who came later that are part of those 39 federally recognized tribes, and lots of relatives who are not federally recognized, who might be state recognized or not have that recognition. So want to recognize those relatives as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you shared, Sarah, right, around what is community here, how that has been impacted, especially in a state like Oklahoma, I think is crucial. And so I really wanted to open up our conversation so you can tell us a little bit more about your work. And I'm flipping through pages like I have a lot, but I'm literally just have like cliff points. But I wanted to start off with just you sharing a little bit more around your work, right? The things that you do, things that I know are your passion, but also the things that we do because we need them, right?
Yeah.
A lot of our work is because of how it impacts us directly and because of the community that we are accountable to ultimately. And so I would love to hear a little bit more as we dive into this conversation.
Yeah, well, most of my work really centers around Indigenous people, education, women and children. And those are kind of if you're looking at my scope of work, that's really where a lot of that lies. Mainly because our women and kids are most vulnerable. And whenever you're looking at rates, especially here in Oklahoma, we have a really high incarceration rate of Indigenous women. And considering Oklahoma does it best, that means worldwide we're incarcerating Indigenous women and women of color, by and large, more than anybody in the world. And so to me, that is atrocious and something that we know is not reflective of our community. And so a lot of that work has to do around like how a lot of grassroots organizing around education, around policy, and really, that to me was very scary at first. You know, like I was very comfortable doing kind of what I call kitchen table organizing, and it's my favorite kind. But then understanding that how policy fits into all of this and how we do have to go under that giant dome to kind of see some sustainability, knowing that we cannot duplicate these efforts forever. We need something that's more with long-standing. Not to say that our communities don't organically do that by nature, but we need some of the things that we're seeing, like VAWA and ICWA and things like that, to really Violence Against Women's Act, Indian Child Welfare Act. Sorry, the acronyms are a little much, but to see things like that really have teeth and really impact for generations. And so I'm the president of the ACLU of Oklahoma. I have a nonprofit called Matriarch with Kendra Wilson Clements that is about education and trauma healing work, and really being, as we know, like that's what the space is about, but it's really about a network of people who come together to support each other. Like ultimately that's what it is. And then I'm one of the founding school board members for Sovereign Community School, which is an indigenized charter school here in Oklahoma City, where we focus on indigenizing curriculum, telling the truth about history, and focusing on wellness of the whole person, not just physical education, but spiritual, relationship to the land, and how all of that feeds together to make us well. And then I'm a part of the Aunties Project, which is an organization that is fairly new, started by Dr. Amanda Cobb Greetham, and just lucky to be in a space with a lot of just badass Indigenous women. I'm a board member for Not Your Mascot, which is an organization that focuses on eradicating Native imagery and mascots. And really just in education in general, we serve in a lot of spaces together as well, like talking about, you know, police task force work, or talking about human rights issues. And I think one of the most beautiful things about doing this work is that we get to work together all the time. Like I think there is, and I think we have been very, we have really made it an effort to involve each other in our communities, to invite each other into these spaces so that we are doing this work together and not in silos anymore, which is kind of how it felt before. And it's easy to do. Like I'm not hating on that, because I've been there before, like been in my space, only working on my things, and then going, wow, like that's not what it means to be a good citizen, which kind of segues into our topic today. Yes. But that's a little bit about what I do.
A little bit. I was just like, where do you find time for all of this thing?
And I work a 9 to 5 for my parents, Redley and Sheep Metal too. So yeah.
I'm like, dang. So things that we learned, there's a lot of work happening. And honestly, I think that what you share already, right, of how do we create sustainable long-term change, gets a little bit of that conversation of like why this series of conversations actually came about, right? Like what does it mean to have like civics at the core of what these conversations are, and like what are civics? Because I hear, and this is something I shared with Cherie in our previous conversation, we talked about civic engagement and the automatic light bulb that goes off. It's like, oh, getting out to vote, getting people out to vote and voting yourself. But for communities like ours, we know that historically that is actually one of the ways in which we're often disenfranchised. And we think of the concept of citizenship in many different ways versus how probably a cis white man who the Constitution was basically written to define as a citizen, right? And what the civic duties and responsibilities were. And so I'm interested to hear a little bit more, because what you were sharing already around like telling the truth about history, and I think some folks say that the truth about herstory. And I heard Kendra share that with us in a space in the past. So I want to hear more about it, And I think it's timely given, the state legislature, everything that is happening. And I want to send a lot of love to the people that are put in that fight, because it's not just a piece of paper. It's impacting people and people's life, and I think it's at the core of why we even show up in so many spaces.
Right. Yeah. Which is why these conversations, like you said, are so important, is because we don't just see erasure. So there's lots of different types of erasure, right? So we see erasure in, and really it's that systemic educational racism that we see, which is basically not telling our stories or romanticizing colonization in a way to make it sound like, oh, nothing was here in Oklahoma before the land run. And it's like, no, friends, like that is not true. And also not just like retelling those stories, but giving, it's our people, our indigenous people know the history, right? Like, so it's not for us. It's not for me. I know the story. My kids know the story. It's for the entirety of humanity to know the story so that we can better appreciate why things are the way they are, right? Like those stories are integral for understanding. And if we don't tell them, or we don't tell them right, then we're gonna have these huge gaps where we don't understand why MMIW is a thing. Why are there so many missing and murdered indigenous women? Why are they targeted at the rate that we are? Why are we seeing all this? Well, there are reasons. There are real reasons, and part of that has to do with that systemic educational racism. But we see things like House Bill 1775 come in, and when we like make strides to like try to change curriculum, and we try to do things like sovereign community school to really make impact, we see a bill come along like this that basically wants to make everything we're doing illegal again, right? And for me, it feels like, so in 1978, it became kind of, it was kind of the first time it was legal to be an indigenous person, because up until that point, it was illegal to sing our songs, to worship the way that we wanted to, our spirituality, all of that was illegal, right? And so it's just been in my lifetime that it's been legal. Well, now we take this piece of policy that wants to, basically eradicate that again, and we're just moving 70 years backwards. And to me, it feels like people don't understand, as you said, the fallout that will have. If we can't talk about critical race theory, if we can't talk about the truth about our history, why are we educating at all? I mean, it's not education, it becomes indoctrination, right? There's a difference between facts and romanticized fairy tales. Like, we can choose what that's gonna be, but let's be honest about it, right? And we're choosing romanticized fairy tales if we decide to abide by this new law, and hopefully it's going to be overturned soon anyway because it's unconstitutional, but it's more taxpayer dollars that are going to be wasted because we have to fight a lawsuit now to be like, hey, dopes, this is unconstitutional, like, you can't do this. So we're coming for you.
Yeah. And I love that you literally just left us that like piece that bridges into a little bit of the following conversation. But thinking about the ways in which Oklahoma, truly, I believe that in my bones, it's having a deep step back and looking at itself. Right? And maybe we're not going to see that from folks that are writing legislation and policy that obviously centers their whiteness. But we're seeing that with other communities, as you share. Like, we are having a moment of we can't do this alone. We can't do it in silos. And also how do we do the internal work, right? Because in many ways, this is so systemic that we've been socialized to believe that the closer we get to whiteness, the safer we are. But, even in offline conversations, we've talked about, the ways in which truly like the pandemic exacerbated what we already knew. It's not that we just, we didn't have a moment of realization, because our people continue to be, disproportionately impacted by healthcare access, by, vaccine, honestly, like, as an undocumented person, the easiest thing for me to do was actually go into healthcare and get a vaccine, and the access that provided. I think it's incredible when we say like we got us, our community got us. To really like sit with that, because I know that bill is like 1775. Like they make us feel really like we're just punching at the air sometimes, right? And I think that really wears our soul down.
Yes.
And I think it's valid to feel that frustration and feel that, that like, where do we turn next?
Right.
Because it's such a long-term fight. But I think the fact that we're here in this conversation,
yes,
right?
It's important to have, and I think that the coalition building that's happening in our state. So even though if there are highlights to the Trump presidency, I think it activated us even more to push further to find coalition building as more of a vehicle than maybe we did in the past. And not to say that we were ever being lazy, because we know we were working hard anyway, but it has mobilized us more than maybe we had been in the past. And to me, that's part of the beauty of what we do, is that interconnectedness, because I know that you and I have both spoken, and this is kind of off topic, but about fallout from doing this work and how it's a real thing. But having like a sisterhood of people who are doing this and being able to take breaks and being able to say, I'm out for a little bit, I gotta step back, or whatever is healthy. And before coalition building, it was kind of like, well, it just dropped off, and this is really a more sustainable mode of transportation for what we're doing, because there aren't those big gaps that there used to be in the past. But yeah, I think, as we talk through like education and some of the obligations of being a citizen, or and I don't even like that word, like a community member, because I feel like so much citizenship, or we're talking about undocumented people, or we're talking about tribal citizenship, which is all just, colonial government constructs, right, of like who's in and who's out. But obligations to community in general, our relatives, is very important. And I think how we think about that, like depending on which community you come from, can look pretty different, right? Like what are, within Western culture, like what are, it's very nuclear family, it's very me, myself, that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and like the whole thing is really hard for me. But within Indigenous community, there were so many different ways of being and knowing and caring for each other that it would not be recognizable from a Western eyes, I don't think. And so, but it's beautiful, and our relationship doesn't stop with personhood, right? Like it doesn't stop in that way. It is relation to land, it is relation to ourselves, it's relation to those who came before us who are not with us, our ancestors. It's thinking 7 generations ahead about like decisions we're going to make now, and our relationships to that 7th generation that isn't here yet. So it's this like huge totality that then shapes the way you make decisions, right? And so as far as my feelings about what are my responsibilities to community, it's first to show up. Like we have to show up for each other. We have to be in the spaces and have the hard talks and hold each other accountable, but also raise each other up and lift up each other's voices, and be there to step in when somebody needs to step back, to raise each other's kids, to be there to understand that this is my space right now, and I have to do as good a job as I can so that when I hand this off to my daughters, they're going to be well prepared for this work. And so that means being intergenerational. So like most of the times when I show up to do work, I've got my girls with me so that they can step into these spaces. When I did it, I was totally unprepared and I made a lot of mistakes. Not to say they won't, but because that's important too. But so that they can come into this knowing how to be revolutionaries from the beginning, because they had strong matriarchs in front of them to show them and invite them into space. So to me, that's a big part of civics, is building sustainable community to continue doing the work and honoring the work of those whose shoulders I sit on. And it also to me means, it's hard for me, I'll say that first, sharing some of indigenous concepts to non-indigenous spaces to try to build commonality when sometimes it's really hard to find commonality, right? Like, how do we build those things if sometimes this base model of like, what do you consider to be success? What does success mean? Well, in indigenous community, it doesn't mean power and money. Like, that's not what it means. Like, so how do we get on a place where we're speaking the same language about like what success is? Success for me is having wellness, is having community, is having relationship, and all these things are like, having, wellness in all the ways. That's success to me. But if I'm talking to somebody whose success is like money, land, power, how do you start that? So I'm gonna ask you, how do you start that conversation, Cynthia? Come on, tell me.
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
Sis, you have the answer, you'll hold now.
And I feel like there's this opportunity of like, to what you're sharing on like, how do we build community? Just even getting like that base alignment of like, how do we invite what we know and our intentions are into the space? And knowing that also like, it's not gonna take like a one-time conversation, right? For us to actually get in the same like wavelength of how we're communicating. Because that's the beauty of also relationship building. You talked about people making mistakes and about learning. Like, we are evolving, ever evolving human beings.
Thank goodness.
And and I think that comes from also saying, we have to take away the things that we've internalized. When I think of land ownership or power structures, they drive us closer to, settler colonialism. They drive us closer to whiteness. And, when we think about representation, well, what does that mean if the goal is power?
Yeah.
If the goal is money? How are you representing people who don't see that as success?
And at the same time, it's so frustrating to me, because then we have to work in those modes to get back what was taken, right? So, and I'm not hating on that, because I know it's necessary, but like, when we see decisions like McGirt come down from the Supreme Court, and we see that, I can't cuss on this, but like, finally, right? Like, yes, these things are upheld. This is Muskogee Creek land, Muskogee land. They've taken the creek out of it. This is Choctaw land, this is Cherokee land, this is Chickasaw land. Like, these are reservations that have never been disallowed, disestablished. And so we have to work within those systems, those gross systems built on power and greed and money, to get back what came to us. So then we have to like subject ourselves to those systems, which then change the dynamic of our communities, right? So now we see within my tribe, the fact that we're a matrilineal matriarchal, you got me started. This is your fault, Cynthia. But like, got us to a place where in a matriarchal society, we have one woman on council, on the tribal council. We're a matrilineal tribe. There are, 11 and a half counties, 12 seats, one woman, one. And I think that is a direct result of patriarchal ways dominating and we've got to try to like survive within the system. So then we have to switch up how we're doing and what we're doing and how we do it to survive within that system. And like, okay, so now how do we get back to that? Like, how do we play the game, right? To do what we need to do, but not lose ourselves in the process. And that is like, you know what, we're not talking about anything we're supposed to talk about today, but you know what? It's okay.
No.
And to me, it's the struggle. It's the struggle of where is the line? How far do you get into it before you lose yourself and you lose all the things that you're fighting for, right? And before it becomes about money and power and land for you too.
Yeah, no, and I think it's connected, honestly, because one of the points around conversation was around colonialism, right? And around how, like, even settled colonialism, I feel like often people think about that, like, things that happened hundreds, if not thousands years ago. And, like, you naming a specific year, right, when it's like, in my lifetime, being an indigenous person was like criminalized because they literally were taking a lot of our identity, our being, what connects us to our own selves.
It was illegal.
Right. And so, you know, I think I want to touch in a little bit more on that, because I know you were talking about how does that relate to the creation of a school, right, that challenges Western education systems.
Yeah.
And the way that, like, globally, we're still seeing settled colonialism take place.
Yes.
And so it's also an invitation for a moment of reflection for folks who are, like, calling out other spaces where violence and occupation and forced removals are currently happening and may not make the connection of how that actually is since the inception of this. Like, literally genocide of people in this land. Yeah,
and it's a really important topic, especially right now. But, you know, I think it's important to talk about there are different kinds of colonization, right? So, colonialism and we have settler colonialism, and so that's a specific kind of colonization where, so there's a type where they come, they conquer, they plant the flag, whatever, and they leave, right, in the name of whatever sovereign. Well, the settler type of colonialism is where they do all that too, but they stay and they don't leave. And so then it permeates everything, and then it becomes about genocide, it becomes about erasure, it becomes, you know, so it's much more steeped in it never goes away, right? So there's not a chance to take a breath and be like, okay, how do we get back? You know, we have to get back as we're fighting it because it is still happening, right? We have to reclaim in the middle of things still being taken. But I think it's also important to know that this is not just, as you said, this is not the only continent where this happens. This has happened. Colonization has happened on every continent, in every country that exists. Indigenous people have been fighting to reclaim spaces or even just be alive in some instances since the beginning of invasion, you know, and that isn't like to be global, talk about global civic citizenship, or not citizenship, but just humans living on this planet. We do have to recognize that those spaces, and I have to do a better job of educating ourselves about how it's impacting people across the globe, because we have very similar stories. The fallout of colonization is very similar. Like, you know, and I know that there are, you know, there are bodies now that help to organize human rights coalitions and, you know, international human rights coalitions who are, you know, starting to build like constitutions and what are the rights of people, and how can we work these systems to try to find not just peace but like justice. And it's, I think it's still very much in its infancy, but I feel like we have to do a better job of working together in those spaces.
Yeah, no, and you know, I think that we talked a little bit about the concept of just like what does it mean to be in community, the impacts, and how do we think of things globally. I mean, I shared this with Cherie last time we talked, and I think you already touched on this. The impact of things happen globally. The U.S. specifically has a deep, ingrained, culture of thinking themselves as a silo nation. And I think that, like, as an immigrant, who doesn't have citizenship, and over the last 20 years, probably, maybe the next 20 may not have, right, a pathway to that citizenship. It has been really eye-opening how that works, because, like, even as someone who came from Mexico, who we have our own struggle and culture and like colonization, right? Because there are still indigenous people who are marginalized and experience violence because they still are not like speaking Spanish, right? And it gets a little bit of the question around language that I wanna really pose to you, because to me it's always been like, well, the fact that I'm speaking even another colonized language, it creates, I wrote a piece where I say my tongue has been fighting to colonize languages my whole existence. And the fact that my accent won't go away because it's the way of my own self telling me that that's not the language I'm meant to speak. And so I think that, like, I want to invite you to talk about the violence that actually comes behind language, the meaning of words, because I know that, citizenship for me, it's a painful word because of what it has meant generationally, what it means for my family currently, what it means for my community, right? The erasure of our own existence just because we don't have a document that literally says I'm supposed to be here.
Right. Or the hypocrisy that somebody's ship got here before yours, but it's okay for them. Let's like not talk about that.
Right. And the fact that, like, when people talk about breaking laws and the violation of, erasing our humanity on the Constitution, which I can go on a whole thing about that.
Do it.
But the Constitution wasn't written for any of us.
Right.
Except a white cis man that owned land that by default was already killing and taking over things, right? So
they call us, merciless savages in some of those constitutional documents. So it absolutely was not, and it's not that it wasn't written for us; it was written to eradicate us. Like it was written for the whole opposite impact, to make this a white. Not white, because white is a construct too, right? Like we could get into all that all day, that white is not a thing. White is something that has been, a word that has been put together and used to basically take all of these other cultures to make them the dominant, right? They are the majority if we call them white, when really if you break them out into their tribes and their people are very there is a lot of similarities and differences between, anyway, so we won't go down that road yet. But language is important, and that is one really important aspect of it, is it can be used to heal or it can be used to divide. In cases like saying white is not a thing, but it is used in a way to dominate, to oppress. Whereas, it's been not that long ago that Oklahoma made English their official language, and there was this huge conversation about well, it's the native tongue of this country. Well, baloney, it sure was not. Let's look at the other 500 languages that existed here before contact. What are the native languages of this space? And that is never considered because it's not Western culture, right? Because brownness or blackness in these spaces is never anything that's considered as true or right or proper or correct. And so in those spaces we aren't considered, and nobody even got the irony of what they were saying, right? To me it was laughable, when people would say the native tongue of this country, or I was just Am I
Is
the
there
only
another
one that
one?
this is hilarious to? Like,
Right.
am I the only one? And so, you're right, language is incredibly important, and some of our indigenous languages are just beautiful. I mean, and they almost inform people about our belief systems, right?
Mhm.
So like there's an indigenous language, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, but the word for baby translates to from the light. So it gives you this understanding of how we feel about life, how we feel about the preciousness that it is from another place, and it is from this good place that these children come to us, and also what we should be doing with them, like that they are precious gifts that are to be cherished and loved. And so because they are not from us, they are from the light. And so when you get into languages like that really help you understand the heart of the people, it gives you this greater understanding of humanity and the humanity within those cultures. So I was going to share, and I think in that vein, as being a good relative in this space, I wanted to share a piece of that with you and with our audience today about my creation story. And so Choctaw people, we believe we were the last people to come out of the earth, so that we came from inside our mother, from the earth, and we came out last because we loved her so much. We didn't want to leave her, we wanted to be with our mother, but we were the last people to come out. And so that in itself tells you how connected we are to land, to this place. And we laid out on the side of this hill, Nanawaya, which is Mother Mound, to dry like clay. And so it gives you even the concept that we ourselves are made up of what our mother is, and which also speaks to creation and matrilineal. Like there's a lot of threads there that we could pull apart, but that's one of the important pieces that helps to even just understand how Choctaw people feel about, like, she is our mother, and we are connected, and there will never be a time when we will not be. Like, my dress and my ribbons are always going to drag the earth and touch my mother and keep me connected. My hair is always going to grow long and be close to my mother. Like, these are pieces of who I am that will always help ground me to my people and to the creation of my people, and even before that. So to me, if you ever get a chance to just go and listen to Indigenous people talk about creation stories, it's just magic. Like, you'll just be like, tell me more. Because it just informs us, right?
Yes.
It informs us, and what better way to do that than through beautiful stories?
Yes, I love that. And I think one of the first spaces that I entered, I was a couple of years ago when someone recited a poem, and I don't want to misname them, but they talked about how we need to create more self-love, and they talked about our relationship to the earth. And what really spoke to me was a line that they shared on how if you were to open yourself and you were to open the land, you will see the same thing. And so to me, it was like one of those moments that really was like, like, let me think more about that, and the way that, you're sharing about that deep connection, and the fact that, like, there is a lot more than what we have been socialized to believe around what the beginning of our own existence is. Or the fact that when we talk about, tails, the last thing we see is light, and the first thing that we see is light. And so there is a lot of things that I feel like I could spend a whole day into this conversation.
In relationship to the land and our responsibility to that relation. Yes, and the fact that it sustains us. It sustains us. It gives us life. If we don't care for it, it doesn't have the ability to sustain us. And the foods that come from it, like, either nourish us or harm us. And it's this beautiful, and there's so many indigenous stories around like our foods and things like that that help us to kind of guide us in a way to understand. And we talked about, there's so many things.
You're like, I could go on and on.
I know, but I know we don't have much time, so I'll stop so that if there are questions that you need to get to.
I feel like you touch base a little bit on kind of like the follow up on like how do we make sure, right, that we're passing this. You talked about like what does it mean to be intergenerational? What does it mean to make sure that the generations after us are able to be equipped with the tools to continue that fight, that work, but also to thrive, right? Because I think one of the things that folks who approach me specifically, and I'm sure to you, is that we're always in survival mode, and that is partially true, right, in many ways. But I think that like thriving, having joy, feeling love, feeling in community is actually what sustains us long term. And those are the things that, you know, I think if I didn't have that, you know, like what am I without that? Like, would I be able to sustain the work that I do? Would I be able to sustain the consistent, you know, reminders on a day-to-day that like systemically there's something literally trying to eradicate me? And so, you know, you shared a little bit about how you take your little ones, your daughters to spaces, and I still have yet to go, but I know that you have been doing classes to pass and build community, right, with other matriarchs and other community members to learn even more. So I wanna hear a little bit of that more extensively before we get to like our last section.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's my favorite work, right? Like this kind of matrilineal, educational, healing ourselves, coming back to these things that were always ours, and sometimes we just have to be reminded of them. Like these things, these gifts, these ways, this knowledge has always been here. It is always ours. We can always come back to it. And sadly, because of the genocide of our people, because of boarding schools that were not schools at all, they were like institutions of basically really just whitewashing Indian kids into white kids, and that erasure that happened in boarding schools, taking away all that culture. So many of our indigenous people lost their ways because, not lost them, it was taken from them. Right. They were punished if they spoke their language, grew their hair, sang the songs. Like they were punished as children, so that then they learned, okay, if I don't want the crap beat out of me, then I need to do these things that keep me safe. So it isn't their fault in any way, but then we have this generation of indigenous people who don't know their ways, who don't feel that connection, but know something's missing. And I don't know how many times I've heard that, especially some of the women who come to matriarch and they're like, I know something's missing. Like there is a connection and I need it back, but I don't know how to get it, and I don't know where to get it. And to me, like one of the most affirming things that anybody has ever said to me too, which came from some of my elders that I then like pass on because I think it's my job, is to say, this has always been your space. These have always been your ways. These have always been your languages, and these have always been your traditions. And they will be here the moment you want to pick them back up, because they are inherently yours, and nothing can keep you from them. And it's almost like they need to hear that they, for lack of a better word, have permission, you know, to step back into those spaces. And that's a shame that we feel like we need permission to come back into something that is inherently ours. But that is what Westernization has made us feel, is like you can either be Indian or you can be white, or you're not Indian enough, or you're, you know, whatever, or you're too dark, or whatever it is. And so the beauty of these spaces is that those colonial constructs, we're not recognizing them. You don't have to show your CDIB card to be a part of matriarch. You don't have to have grown up traditional, or you don't have to, like, if you identify as an indigenous woman or two-spirit or non-binary person, this is your space. And we want our girls to come alongside us to make sure that while mamas are healing from a lot of that trauma, that organically is doing preventative work.
Right.
Our girls are hearing it and they're like, oh, okay, you know, like, here are the tools that I'm building, and I'm seeing my mom heal, so I know how to heal too if I need to do those things, but also here's the knowledge that I need to do prevention work. And so it's this intergenerational, and we have grandmas there too who offer this wisdom, this incredibly, this gift to our women about their experiences as well, that just turn into this, it's a healing circle.
Right.
It's this intergenerational wealth of knowledge that we just hold space, and it comes, you know how it is, like you just basically put out some food.
Right.
And if you build it, they will come, and so build of dreams or whatever, how weird that I would think of that, but anyway, and it is, and it's a beautiful thing, because it's an important thing, and we don't know have nearly enough spaces in our communities for women to do healing work and to be around other women where nothing is expected of them.
Right.
You know, you could sit and you cannot say a word, or you can be me who won't shut up, you know? And so that's a little bit about it, but like, you know, within that space, one of my sweet sisters, who's just so brilliant, Inadina Banks, shared that within their culture, they have a lot of rites of passages that happen for their girls. And so when they start their moon, and that's what we call menstruation, when they have their moons, that once a month time, auntie or someone will come in and teach them a different skill. Like, so for that first moon, there'll be an auntie that comes and teaches her how to bead, and that second moon that comes around, maybe learn how to cook a certain meal. Next one is maybe regalia or whatever it is, but you're learning different skills. So it's like this rite of passage, right? Like you're literally learning the skills of how to be an adult person. And then at the end of that year, she takes all these things that she has created and she gives them away. So that it's this time, and also some of our girls, they go on a berry fast too, where they have to, you know, it's a sweet thing, it's a treat, and you can't for, you know, a certain amount of time, but it teaches them how to say no. So when people say, would you like berries, you have to learn how to say no, I can't have berries. And so it teaches them how to engage, how to say no, how to speak with other adults. And it's just like, if we had more of these kinds of rites of passage to help our youth understand what their responsibilities are to community, how to engage their voice, we'd be doing a lot better, you know, because it gives you feeling of foundation and belonging.
Right, yeah, and like you said, by the autonomy, also making choices for yourself to be like, I think the piece around like showing up without having to have any expectations of other people. I mean, as women of color, there's always something that we're carrying, right? There's always this expectation that we have to do the work for other people to be able to enter the space. And I think that, you know, it speaks volumes of just how much more we have yet to go in order for us to, when I think, you know, I did an exercise a couple of years back, writing to that 7th generation person, like who do I think, and obviously I have a niece and nephew, and so I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, what if they have kids, or, you know, if they don't, who's another person that I'm thinking about? And I think it's really eye-opening. It's eye-opening to think how do the decisions and the choices that I'm making for myself are impacting people that have not yet, you know, even being present. And I think that those conversations are definitely crucial. And so, you know, I feel like we're getting a time, and I could talk forever.
Yes.
I'm just like,
you're like, yes.
And honestly, I feel like we find a lot about ourselves and our common shared values, and not values where it's like, let me, you know, thump my chest and show out who I am, but really what connects us, right? And I know that when we talk about connectivity and how do we stay engaged, you and I have touched base about how social media has been able to do that, especially, COVID-19 threw a curveball at us and showed us how much more is there to learn around technology, but also it has shown us the ways in which we already know, right, is predominantly driven by white males who program and create the systems and who create very, systemic racism even within platforms. And so I want to hear a little bit about how you've been able to move in that space, and also like what are some of the offerings that I think even social media has provided for the work that you do.
Yeah. Well, first, I think, it's important to say that, not everybody has access, right, to those platforms and to Wi-Fi or to a computer or to a phone. And that, in my community, we've found, especially with Sovereign Community School, when COVID hit, we had to find a way to make sure to get, computers out to everybody and hotspots, because a lot of times Wi-Fi was a problem, and even and especially in rural, remote areas, that's a huge barrier. And so being mindful that it's a privilege to even be able to have access is something that I take for granted. But whenever we were having our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's National Day of Remembrance, there were lots of posts going up on Instagram that were being erased. And, of course they said, well, it's not specific to your movement, it's not specific to these posts. But it was but it was.
Right.
So,
they happen to be specific about this topic.
Yeah, all of the ones that had these tags seemed to get taken down, and even people who had other posts that didn't, made several posts in one single day, if they didn't have those hashtags, they were left alone, so it was we understand that, yes, these systems are fueled by money, by power, by men, by and large, and they will always be systems to make money. At the end of the day, that's what they're for. They're there to make money. They might be under the guise of connectivity, which is a piece of it, but it's still about money. And so, but on the flip side of that, we've done more organizing via social media than was ever possible before. It was, I think back to, those who did work before me, people with who are organizing under AIM, and were doing that sort of work, and how much harder they had to work to get the word out about things, to make sure that, some of these things happen, and I can go on and in 10 minutes have a post up and out and have it shared with, a lot of people. And that is a luxury we didn't have back in the day. And so I think that even though there are these two sides of social media, it has helped us be more equitable in our work to be able to give people more access to be involved if they want to be. But there are, of course, problems with any of those things, because people who don't have the money for that sort of thing will still be excluded. And it's harder and we have to be more diligent in that work to make sure that we're not stopping there, to make sure that we're going to our community centers, to make sure that we're checking on our elders, to make sure that we are in those spaces where our relatives who don't have access can still be met.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you so much. And the fact that we're having this conversation here
On
and
social
on
media,
social media, I think it speaks values to that.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everybody who has shared the live. Again, thank you for Workflow for hosting, and Ginger for that amazing introduction. We have one more section that is going to be coming up in the month of June. If you haven't gotten to share, tag a friend. I know you tagged me on a post. I've been doing awful on my social media this last week. But I think I want to close out with a question of how do you take care of yourself, or what is the intention? Because I know
Why you
it's
do
a
that to
learning.
me?
It's a learning. It's a learning. But you know, a good friend asked me, "How are you taking care of yourself?" And I think it made me more conscious of how I'm actually doing that. So I think I'm throwing it
Why
back at
you
you.
doing that back at me? See how you do me, Cynthia. It's an important question, and it's a question that we don't ask ourselves enough. I think that also says that there are times when these colonial values of women have infiltrated us, and that we have to decolonize the spaces in our mind to remember our worth and our value and our magic, to know that how would I treat somebody who I valued and loved and say, well, that's me. For me, it's time with my sisters. It's beading. It's time with my children. It's time by the water or by the fire, which have different effects on me. I go to the water when I need to lay things down and just lay it down, and fire when I need to reorganize my thoughts and get things reorganized in my head. And honestly, time with my mother too. She is like the most maternal person on the planet, and she, just by being around her, it's like her presence gives me somehow in my brain the not excuse, but what am I trying to say here? Permission to cry.
Right.
And that's really hard for me. Like, that is a very hard thing for me to do, because sometimes we feel like we always have to be on, or we have to always be strong, or we have to, you know, and that is not human, and it's not our ways either. Like, balance is our way. And so I would say all of those things, especially just being with my sisters, is just, it's magic. It refills my cup. So, and sometimes a good old Netflix, like just spacing out and having some good food, fry bread makes me happy too. So there's that.
No, thank you, and you know, the purpose of the question is also to make sure that we're asking each other, right? We're laying into this new normal, whatever that means. I know that, you know, there's a lot of conversations yet to be had, and so reach out to a friend, make sure that they're doing okay, and reach beyond the surface, because on the surface we're all doing our best, but it's always critical that we get to the how are we actually connecting with you. So thank you so much. Appreciate y'all. Whoever joined today, make sure you share. You leave a lot of love for Sarah, and we will see you for our June session.
Sounds good. Chipisa la Chiki. Thank you.
Thank you.